When we talk about the Indian Wars in Texas, it's often presented as a very exciting, adventurous sort of time period with these great battles and famous war chiefs and army commanders. But the reality is, the Indian Wars are, quite frankly, a very tragic time in our nation's history. The wars were brutal. And we've talked about this before, but during the Indian Wars, generally, because the native tribes are not going to fight the same way that American and Texan frontiersmen or troops would fight, it's generally going to, instead of being warriors and soldiers meeting on a battlefield, it's going to be raids made on each other's homes. Native tribes had always used raids to intimidate other tribes and to keep them at a distance to protect their own tribal lands. And so, what you see quite often is native tribes would attack settlers on the frontier. And, like in the case of Cynthia Ann Parker, who we talked about earlier this year, in 1836, the Parker family built a fort about almost 100 miles further west than any other white family had. And they built it right on the edge of Comanche. And on a spring day, as the menfolk went out farming about a mile from the fort with the gates wide open, they only left a few men and the women and children back in the fort. And a party of about 100 Comanche and possibly a few other Indian hunters who were along rode up to the fort. They were probably out on a buffalo hunting expedition, but they came across the fort and decided to, well, at first, they came by and said that they wanted a little bit of beef from the Texans and maybe directions to where water was. However, the Parker family very quickly realized that these Indians weren't really there to get a little bit of stuff from them, that they probably were going to attack them. And so while one of the men went out and talked to the Indians, the others tried to escape out the back of the fort. Unfortunately, they couldn't close the gates quick enough. The first man was pinned to the ground with lances and brutally killed. The Indians rode in, captured some of the men, women, and children, killing the men and torturing them, kidnapping 3 of the children and 1 of the women. The other Parker, the men managed to come back, rescue 1 of the women, and then escape into the woods. And eventually the Parker family made their way back to Texas, to other civilized areas. However, little Cynthia Ann was taken prisoner, and she was raised by the Comanches as one of their own, as we talked about earlier. That was one of the things they would do, is capture prisoners and make them part of their own tribe. And she grows up, and she will become the mother of a little boy named Quanah Parker. She'll marry a chief, Pettinacona. And she basically had kind of forgotten about her previous way of life that she'd been kidnapped from as a little bitty girl. But unfortunately for her, it worked both ways. Not only was there a raid by Comanches on Texans, but later, when she was a adult woman with 3 children and a husband, her camp was attacked by Texas Rangers. And they managed to kill a number of her friends and possibly her husband. She was captured. When they realized she had blue eyes, they realized she wasn't actually Comanche, but she had been born a Texan. And they figured out who she was and brought her back to members of the Parker family. And she actually spent the last few years of her life trying to escape back to her native family where she wanted to be. So unfortunately for her, she experienced both sides of the Indian Wars in the most brutal way. Being ripped from her family and seeing loved ones killed brutally by Indians, and then later being torn from her family and seeing loved ones killed by Texans. And this was the way the wars generally were fought, with brutal attacks. So it's often not so much heroic as brutal, the way these Indian wars are fought, but it's a struggle. The frontiersmen, the Texans, are trying to secure their way of life, establish farms, have a good life for their families. At the same time, the native tribes, they're trying to hold on to their lands that they had had for generations, trying to hold on to their way of life. And unfortunately, we never find a way for these two ways of life to coexist. Instead, through a brutal series of wars over more than a century of time, the native tribes will be pushed from their native way of life eventually to reservations. So during the Civil War, the native tribes are going to get a little bit of a break. Texans, along with other Americans, had gone back east to kill each other for a change instead of encroaching on native territory. Down south, especially where there was a shortage of manpower, there just weren't enough troops in the South to fight both the Yankees and send troops out west to adequately deal with Comanches and Apaches. Once Comanches realized that there wasn't much of a military presence to stop them, they began striking back against settlers on the frontier, trying to reclaim parts of what had been their land. And so in 1864, the Elm Creek Raid begins a series of raids against Texans on the frontier, pushing them back from near the Panhandle region all the way back to East Texas, reclaiming hundreds of square miles of land for Comanches. Now, the Elm Creek Raid, Comanche warriors rode in and burned homes, killing and kidnapping, and the settlers fled. Now, after the Elm Creek Raid, there's a fellow by the name of Britton Johnson who makes a name for himself here in Texas. Britton Johnson's wife had been captured by Comanches during the Elm Creek Raid, along with some other women and children from various families spread out along the creek. Now, the unique thing about Britton Johnson was he was African American. He was a freedman living out on the frontier. And remember, this is during the Confederacy here in Texas. He, as other people fled, he decided that he would go after the Comanches and try to find his wife. And so what he does alone, he travels into Comancheria, hunting down the Comanches who had kidnapped his wife, as well as the families of other settlers along the frontier. And so he heads into Indian territory, putting his own life at great danger. And he travels from village to village into dangerous territory, hunting down the ones who had captured his wife. Ultimately, he is able to locate his wife as well as other members of the community that had been captured, and is able to negotiate to get them released. And he ends up making a name for himself and kind of becoming a hero here in Texas, even though he's a freedman, even though this is still the Confederacy. That kind of courage and saving members of his community did make him a legend. Now, ultimately, he'll continue to live on the frontier, and eventually he'll die in a fight with Indians in which they say that the cartridges from his gun around the place where he died were piled up by the dozens, where he had just been holding out against all odds, holding off the warriors who had attacked his little group of travelers. So he made a pretty impressive impression on Texans for his courage and heroism on the frontier. Now, both in the North and in the South, Indians had gone on the warpath. And after the Civil War was over with, the United States government still had 10 years of occupying the South ahead of it, trying to reconstruct the South. And people wanted their loved ones home from the war, and they didn't want to send a bunch of people out to fight a bunch of wars against native tribes. So both in the North and in the South, treaties were made with native tribes on the frontier to try to get them to settle into limited areas called reservations and to try to make peace with the warring tribes. In the North, it was the Treaty of Fort Laramie. In the South, on the Southern Plains, the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek between the United States government And some of the chiefs of the Southern Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Kiowa, and Arapaho tribes supposedly was going to bring peace. The chiefs who signed it agreed to move to limited areas, most of those in the area marked Indian Territory, which is present-day Oklahoma. They were granted rights to leave reservations to do certain amounts of hunting at certain times of the year, and they were promised that the needs that they could not be met because they were staying in a limited area would be met by the U.S. government with extra blankets, with extra meat and food rations. However, not every native signed this agreement. So if you'll pause the video for a second and go to page 418, have a couple of students read what Comanche Chief Tin Bears and what Kiowa Chief Santata had to say about these treaties, about the idea of leaving their native lands and moving to a reservation. As you can see, Tin Bears and Santata spoke for a number of the Comanches and Kiowas and other Indians on the frontier who were not willing to go to reservations. They wanted to hold on to the land which had been theirs by birth. However, even though they refused to sign, the United States government figured, hey, we have a few chiefs from this tribe have signed it, therefore all the Kiowas, all the Comanches have agreed and must abide by this rule, because that's the way we as Americans, with one president, viewed treaties, that it applies to everybody. So, more and more settlers come out to the frontier, and for a while there's a bit of a peace. But some of these natives, including Santata, who had not agreed to this treaty, they're continuing to go out and to hunt and to live off of the reservation. In 1871, an incident between some of these warriors and some settlers moving further west at a place called Salt Creek got the attention of the U.S. government. Now, the new commander of the whole United States Army was General William Tecumseh Sherman. His former commanding officer, General Grant, had become president of the United States, and Sherman had been promoted to the top general in the Army. And he came out west to inspect the frontier forts, and he, with just a couple of men, had rode a carriage out to visit a fort out in the Panhandle region of Texas. And a group of warriors were planning to ambush settlers moving west. And they saw that little army carriage, and they looked at it, and they said, there's barely anybody there. Let's let it pass. Let's wait for a better target. And they missed massacring and killing the leader of the United States Army. But a few hours later, a wagon train came along, and they attacked this wagon train. One of the men did get away and went to that fort where General Sherman, who had just been through that territory, now was. And he accompanied the army back to the site of the attack, and they found those mutilated bodies and the devastation that had been left behind. And he realized that could have been him. And he was furious. Now, if you remember, Sherman dealt with the Confederacy with this whole concept of, if you remember, he was famous for the saying, war is hell. And what he meant by that was, we're not going to just have hell on the battlefield where it's a horrible place to be, but we're going to make it miserable for the families back home. He was the one who marched through Georgia and burnt crops, and homes were destroyed to break the Confederacy's will to resist. Well, now, as leader of the U.S. Army, he is going to turn his attention to breaking the natives' will to resist and force the native tribes to reservations. So he is going to, first of all, send out the U.S. Army to go hunt down these warriors who had made this attack and to force Indians who were not on reservations to the reservations. So Randall S. McKenzie is sent to command troops here in Texas, and he is going to relentlessly, for the next few years, chase native tribes. He'll have a hard time catching them, because they always seem to be able to move and stay one step ahead of them. But the fact that he's out here chasing the natives that are not on the reservation means they can't settle down. They can't have a minute's peace. They're constantly on the run. And he's wearing them down. And we'll come back to him in just a minute. Now, meanwhile, another focus of this war, just like in the South, Sherman destroyed the food and crops that supported the Confederacy. The U.S. Army is going to encourage the destruction of the Indians' food supply. Their walking Walmart, the buffalo, was what the Plains tribes used to survive. And buffalo hunting had become a lucrative business during the 1870s. Hunters would come out west, and they would bring their Sharps big 50 caliber buffalo hunting rifles, and a group of 5 or 6 men would find a herd, and they would, at a distance, downwind from the herd so the herd couldn't smell them and wouldn't hear the gunshots. And they would, at long range, start shooting down buffalo. And once the herd got spooked and started running, then they'd hop on their horses and chase the herd, continuing to shoot down buffalo. And they might chase buffalo for several miles, leaving hundreds of buffalo dead. And what they would then do is go from carcass to carcass, skinning the buffalo and taking their hide, and leaving everything else. They just took the hides, which were valuable back east as coats and as rugs. That was the fad at the time, to have a cool, fuzzy buffalo robe. And also cutting out the tongues and putting them in salt, because that had become a delicacy back east, eating buffalo tongue. But the 1,000 pounds of meat was just left there to rot. And when natives came along to hunt the buffalo, instead of finding herds of buffalo as far as the eye could see, they'd look to the horizon and see these pink, rotting carcasses dotting the ground. The natives had to do something to save their way of life. And Cynthia Ann Parker's little boy, Quanah Parker, is going to start this final phase of the Indian Wars here in the panhandle of Texas. He is going to lead Comanches, Kiowas, and Southern Cheyennes to attack a buffalo hunting outpost at a place called Adobe Walls. He knows that the buffalo hunters are the danger. They're the threat. So he gets about 500 warriors. This is a huge war party. And he attacks a small little village in the middle of nowhere, right in the middle of the Texas Panhandle, hundreds of miles from the nearest town. And at this little location, that's where buffalo hunters came to buy more gunpowder and bullets and ammunition and supplies while they were out hunting. And there was a little general store there, and there was a little saloon, and that was pretty much the whole town. When those 500 warriors attacked that morning, there were 31 people. There were 30 men and 1 woman in the little village. Fortunately for them, instead of being surprised at dawn and slaughtered, a beam in the saloon ceiling had broke that night, waking the people that were sleeping inside up, making them fear the roof was going to cave in on them. And they had to get up early and repair that roof, and they were awake when the Comanches and their allies attacked. That's what saved their lives. They fled to the general store and took refuge inside as Indian warriors attacked. The Indian warriors did catch one guy before he could make it, and he was killed. One more man will die in the battle when he is climbing down a ladder inside the general store, carrying a loaded gun, and he will drop it and accidentally kill himself. The others will survive because they're inside a store with an unlimited number of guns and ammunition. And they managed to hold off this whole party of Comanche, Kiowa warriors until the Indians had to give up. So the Battle of Adobe Walls was a failure for the natives. They couldn't kill the hunters that were there. But that didn't stop them. They realized, okay, we can't get them if they're in a gun shop. But if we go out to the plains and we find 5 or 6 of them skinning buffalo, we can kill them. And so they start going out to the plains and slaughtering the hunters and terrorizing settlers in the area. So the army is sent to deal with them. Ultimately, it will be Randall S. Mackenzie that will confront the Comanche. Now, the Comanche end up taking refuge in Palo Duro Canyon. It was in the middle of the Llano Estacado, that flat, flat plain that, as far as you could see, it was just flat land. But the canyon drops down lower. And for hundreds of years, this had been a secret hiding place for the Comanches. The last white man to have visited the canyon, supposedly, had been Coronado. This was the perfect hiding place during the winter to keep them warm from those cold winds blowing over their heads above the canyon. It was a good hiding place with plenty of water and a place for them to corral their many horses and to rest during the winter. Well, the Comanches were hiding there, but unfortunately for them, Ranald Mackenzie did manage to capture some Comancheros. Comancheros were men of mixed Mexican and native ancestry, and they traded out of New Mexico with the Comanche. And oftentimes they would sell them guns and ammunition. Oftentimes they would buy back from them people that they had kidnapped that had not been assimilated into their tribe, and then the Comancheros would negotiate with families and get payment to get these people released. They weren't necessarily the most respectable group of people as far as Texans were concerned. Well, Mackenzie catches some of them, and he's able to find out from them the secret hiding place of the Comanche. So the Comanche are going to be surprised in their winter home. They're camped along the canyon floor by the river. And at the end of this box canyon, they have their herd of over 2,000 horses, which is their means of survival. They fight on these horses. They hunt on these horses. It is the basis for their way of life. Well, the army finds them there, and they're totally surprised. The army charges down a sheer cliff wall into the canyon, cutting them off from their horses. And what takes place is the most decisive Indian battle that the United States Army ever fought. And it will forever end the power of the Comanche people. And you would think it's a big bloody battle and hundreds die, but actually 5 or 6 men are all that are killed. The Comanche men come out, they see the army charging their camp, and they fight, buying time for the elderly and for the women and the children to flee. And they escape. And then the warriors retreat. But even though they did manage to escape, they had to leave behind them all of their teepees, all of their possessions, all of the food they had stored up for winter, and all of their horses. They are now left on foot in the winter with nothing to eat. Mackenzie ordered their village burnt to the ground, and everything they owned was destroyed. Then he marched his men down to the end of the canyon, lined up a firing squad, and executed 2,000 Indian ponies. Now, you may think that sounds cruel, but if he tries to take the ponies with them, the Indians will do like they had done to him 2 years before when he had captured Indian horses. They'll sneak up on his camp, make a bunch of noise, stampede the horses will run away, and they'll get their horses back. And he doesn't want them to regain the ability to fight or to hunt, so he executes 2,000 Indian horses. And the Comanche are left afoot, starving, with no way to hunt and no way to fight. And they will walk to Oklahoma and surrender. And the days of the Comanche Nation controlling Comancheria come to an end. Now, the very last natives to be fighting in Texas are going to be way down on the Rio Grande. Victorio will be the last great Apache chief, leading Mescalero Apaches back and forth across the Mexican border, trying to survive. The United States Army will chase him, and he'll run and hide in Mexico. Then the Mexican Army will chase him, and he'll run and hide in the U.S. And to survive, he will fight, he will make raids, because he will constantly be chased. But it's for over 2 years, both the U.S. and the Mexican Army are going to fruitlessly try to hunt him down. He was clever. He knew how to avoid them. He knew how to make attacks. He knew how to hide. Oftentimes, as he was coming back into the United States, his women and children would make one caravan and travel into the U.S., and his warriors would go a different direction. And they would make a lot of noise and stir up a lot of dirt. The army would come chase them, and then they would just run away and disappear. And the women and children would have already made it into the U.S. safely and been undetected. He was good at outsmarting the army. Eventually, though, General Benjamin Grierson and the 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalry are sent to deal with Victoria. Now, the 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalry are what we call the Buffalo Soldiers. The U.S. Army was segregated back then by race. So you have a unit of white soldiers and a unit of black soldiers. And the 9th and 10th Cavalry were black soldiers. And they were called by the Indian Buffalo Soldiers. And the 9th and 10th Cavalry are going to doggedly pursue Victoria. And Grierson begins understanding the way to try to deal with Victoria. He is moving from watering spot in that dry land to watering spot. And so in order to stop him from being able to move, he starts stationing groups of troops around each of the watering holes, limiting Victoria's ability to move. And finally, he brings him to battle. At the Battle of Rattlesnake Springs, the Buffalo Soldiers clash with the Apache warriors, and they manage to defeat the Apaches, driving them back into the mountains. They don't wipe them out, though. The Apaches escape into the mountains and over the border into Mexico, but they will never again re-enter the United States. While they're in Mexico, now the Mexican army is pursuing them and eventually does catch up with what's left of Victorio's band, and Victorio and the remaining warriors are killed. And after Victorio is defeated in 1880, the Indian Wars in Texas come to a close. All of the native tribes have been forced onto reservations. And so what I'd like you to do now is turn to the reading in your book, and you will read about what life was like on the reservations for the native tribes and discuss that.